Hey there folks, Tim Slade here, and welcome back to the ATD Ask a Trainer video series. In today's episode, my special guest Bianca Woods and I are answering your questions about visual design for e-learning, so stay tuned. You know, when you fall into the world of e-learning, there's so much about the job that no one tells you about. Not only do you need to be a good instructional designer, but you also need to be a good project manager, user interface designer, a video editor, an audio editor, sometimes an LMS administrator, and occasionally the only one who knows how to unjam the copying machine in the office. And then, of course, there's the visual design and graphic design aspects of the job. And this is the one area that I think most folks in our industry struggle to master. In fact, it's the number one thing I get asked about more than any other topic related to e-learning. So let's get to your questions about visual design for e-learning. All right, thank you so much for joining us, Bianca. Now, for those who are watching who may not know who you are and what you do, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, so Bianca Woods. I am Senior Manager of Programming for the Learning Guild. That means, among other things, I'm picking the sessions that happen at our events. I'm setting up online conferences. I'm helping bring in new speakers and encourage existing speakers. You know, if it touches what happens at the live and online events, I'm usually involved in some way.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, we've known each other for years through the conferences, but even before you were involved in the Learning Guild, I know you were, you did a lot of e-learning development. I know you have a passion for visual design as much as I do.
Yeah, there's a very, very small group of us in the field that are super nerdy about visual design. So I think we all know each other.
Yeah, I think we do. Well, fantastic. Well, are you ready to help me answer some questions? Cool. All right, well, let's get to our first question. Our first question comes from, and I'm going to have to apologize because I know I'm going to mispronounce this. I'm going to say Elena Baraboy Kaluk. Oh, I apologize if I got that wrong, but Elena wants to know, what tips can you share for selecting fonts and colors for my e-learning courses? I think this is the one thing I think a lot of people struggle with colors and fonts, because I think those are the basics of visual design. You always start with fonts and colors, and I know I struggle with those. What's your take on that, Bianca?
If you don't have guidelines at work that you have to follow, which I think we're going to be covering later, from the font perspective, look for readability. So what you want is fonts that aren't too visually complicated, because those can kind of look okay for a logo, but to try and read a whole bunch of text in that, it's exhausting to your eyes. So simple serif and sans serif fonts work really well. There used to be a mindset that serif was better for digital or rather serif was better for print and sans serif was better for digital. It hasn't really held up to research. But as long as you're looking at fonts and they don't have a lot of fussy details, they're usually pretty easy to read. And then for colors, really it's pick a set color palette, a small selection of colors that all look good together, that you use consistently throughout your design. And if you're really not good at figuring out color palettes on your own, there are tools online, as well as color palette curators out there who will put out palettes that you can just pull from and use for inspiration.
Yeah, I totally agree. I use Adobe Color. You can go to color.adobe.com. I use that all the time to create color schemes. I struggle when it comes to picking color schemes, so I always use tools for those. And then to your point with fonts, like, it's always readability over style any given day. And so for me, I think it's about picking, whether you're going with serif or sans serif, picking contrasting fonts for your headers and your body content. That helps give a sense of, visual hierarchy to the flow of your content. So I totally agree with all that.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to fonts, the thing that you mentioned of one type of font for your headers and a different one for your body text, that's a pretty simple formula. If you do one sans serif and the other one serif, you can also honestly just use one font for your entire design, and differentiate with size and things like bolding. There's nothing unprofessional about only using one font if it's a good one.
Absolutely, or differentiate with color or anything. Yeah, I totally agree with that. All right, good. Well, thank you for that question, Elena, and hopefully that helps. All right, so our second question comes from Emily Wood. Hi, Emily. And Emily wants to know, how can you follow your company's brand guidelines without all of your e-learning courses looking exactly the same? I love this one because I used to be a firm believer that each e-learning course had to look unique, be unique, just because like Emily brings up, I used to think, gosh, well, everything's going to be the same. And my opinions kind of changed over the years, but I'll let you give your take on that, Bianca, and then I'll share my thoughts.
So I used to work for a bank, a huge Canadian bank, before I worked for the Learning Guild. So this is near and dear to my heart.
Yep.
I think you're trying to find a balance between it looks visually cohesive with the company's brand, but that it doesn't look like you use the exact same template for everything. And that might sound hard at first when you're thinking about company brand guidelines, but what I recommend doing, if your company has this, is look to the advertising that your company puts out. Because when I first started working at the bank, that was the best way for me to understand the breadth of what you could do within style guidelines, because advertisers are amazing at this.
Yep.
So what you want to do is kind of pick out not just the things that are going to be in your brand guidelines, like what font you can use and what colors are allowable, but also what kinds of photographs does the advertising use? What kind of design elements do they use? The bank that I used to work for, circles was a huge thing, but what you can do within the realm of circles is there's so much from a design perspective. So like, see what you can play with without breaking the brand guidelines.
Yep. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, my take on this has been, to your point, it's less about making everything look consistent and the same, and it's more about, to your point, being cohesive, which I think are two different things. And so, for example, usually what the marketing department's really wanting you to do is adhere to color palettes, making sure you're using the logo properly, you're using the proper fonts. And usually those are elements that, you might have the logo in the player or in the header, or you have certain shapes, but everything else as it relates to the content, that's going to be different because the content's always different. And then the other thing I've come to realize is, oftentimes we're asked to follow the company's brand standards, and we're given the brand standards that apply when creating PowerPoint presentations. We'll be given the PowerPoint template. Well, or, when you're doing e-learning, yeah, it's similar to PowerPoint, but it's really not PowerPoint. And so you have to think about how to adapt those guidelines to e-learning, and you can create unique courses that are cohesive, but not all the same.
Yeah, I'd agree with you too. If you are given the PowerPoint standards, push back a little bit, because it's not a direct map, and I think it pushes e-learning in directions that maybe doesn't work as well for the form factor.
Yep, I totally agree with that. Yeah, and to your point, look for inspiration on the website of the company, how marketing's using it, and you'll find a lot of different variation and how you can be cohesive but not the same. All right, thank you so much, Emily. Okay, so our next question comes from Gustavo Gonzalez. That's an awesome name, Gustavo. And Gustavo wants to know, how do you keep your e-learning courses visually consistent when you have multiple developers? It kind of goes back to Emily's question. This one, a little bit of a different take of visual consistency when having multiple developers. So here's what I'm going to say about that, and then I'll let you give your take, Bianca. I think it is important to have a style guide, but here's what I'll say that's a little bit of a different take than what we were just talking about with Emily's question. Have a style guide, but have an e-learning style guide. Create your own style guide that incorporates your company's branding into an e-learning format, and maybe create a really basic template, whether it's in Storyline, Captivate, or whatever tool you're using, that you can share and ensure those elements, the fonts, the colors, the images, and the layout are consistent between your courses. I don't know. What's your take on that, Bianca?
Yeah, something similar. I usually will do, even if there is a broader brand guideline document, I'll do a project design guidelines.
Yep.
And it is sort of, if you think about, I'm going to go outside for inspiration again. Think about magazine layouts. Each page, doesn't look identical, but there are certain page types so that it all feels like it goes together. Like there's a page type with 2 lines of copy. There's page type with a big photo and a little bit of text. There's page type with half photo, half text. If you figure out what some of your core page or screen types are going to look like, that sets you up for consistency without having every single screen or page look identical.
Yep.
And decide what are the rules, what's always happening. Like, what's your border? Like, I think a page border consistency, you want that across the board. What kinds of images are you using? Do they spread across the whole screen, or are they in a box? You want that to be consistent. But I think even within that, you'll still have a lot of room to play so that you're not feeling too boxed in. It's that balance between enough of a box that it all looks like it goes together, but not so much box that you feel like a machine just plugging content in.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, the other thing about design is even if you have brand standards, designs evolve over time. There's layouts that might work for your content that are within your brand standards that you may never have even realized until you had a need to use it. And so I think it's about figuring out what's the minimal amount of consistency you need so that when a learner launches a course, there's no question it's a course from your company. And usually those minimal things are some consistency with layout, for example, where the slide header is or the footer, fonts, colors, and use of imagery maybe. Good. Well, hopefully that helps answer that question, Gustavo. All right, so our next question comes from Monica Almedia. I apologize if I didn't get your last name correct, Monica. And Monica wants to know, what are the most common e-learning visual design mistakes I should avoid? Oh gosh, I can imagine this would be a long list. If we could probably do a whole video on this. What is your take on that?
Video.
Yeah, it would be a fun video. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Bianca?
All right, so full disclosure, I used to be an art teacher. So I'm bringing that lens to this. Here are the things that I see really well-intentioned people do all the time.
Yep.
Put too much stuff on a page. White space, so stuff that isn't occupied by copy or buttons or visuals, is really important. It visually keeps things from looking cluttered. It also gives your brain tiny bits of rest as it takes in new information. So that's good from a learning perspective and also from a visual design perspective. It's also something that you don't need to be an amazing artist to be good at. Just go, is there too much stuff on this layout? Consistent types of imagery. I see people who don't have a lot of comfort with graphic design mix and match wildly different photograph styles or mix and match illustrations with photographs. And it's possible to do that, but it's hard.
Yep.
So just keep that consistent. Go, if you're going to use photographs for the whole thing. If you're going to use illustrations for the whole thing. And even figure out what kinds of photographs, like mix and matching black and white photographs with color photographs isn't going to feel really cohesive. So just figure out what kinds of images am I using, what isn't in scope, and just be consistent across the board with that. And then we talked about this earlier, font choice. Keep it simple, 1 or 2 fonts tops.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think whenever I think of mistakes from a visual design standpoint, obviously, using photos from the same photo family, like you mentioned, choosing consistent fonts and colors. I always get the most distracted by some of the technical considerations. So like making sure things are evenly distributed and aligned. If something's like misaligned by even a pixel, I'm one of those people that will notice that. Or you notice when you have several slides and you go through the slides, you'll notice, elements that are supposed to be in the same location shift a little bit, that's an indicator you're not using master slides or something similar, whatever tool you might be using. And then the final thing I always say, like with photos, I'm one of those people, don't distort your photos. Make them keep the aspect ratio and choose modern photography that looks like real people doing real things in real working environments. Not that 98 circa photography. Yeah.
I will say the habit that some people used to have of distorting photos, I haven't seen that as much lately. And I think some of it is the software we have for creating things has some checks and balances built in to prevent it. It used to be super easy to accidentally distort a photo.
Yeah, I used to have a boss who would I would sit and watch her go, look, I'm resizing, and she'd resize from the edge and stretch it, and it just made me want to die inside. So, but yes, you're right. A lot of tools have helped prevent bad design from that standpoint.
Well, and the layout thing too, PowerPoint and tools like it are now so much easier to figure out if stuff's in line. It's made what used to be very difficult so much easier.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, good. Well, hopefully that helps Monica. Thanks for the question. All right, so our next question comes from Jesse Jarowitz. And this is a fantastic question, Jesse. Jesse wants to know, what are the most important visual design considerations when designing for accessibility? And I think we would be remiss if we didn't answer this question, because accessibility is on everybody's radar right now. And I am not an accessibility expert. From my standpoint, I think the biggest thing is using alt text in your images, and of course, and Bianca, I'll let you answer what that means if anyone doesn't know. And I always think about contrasting colors, people who might have color impairments or anything like that. But do you have a take on accessibility with visual design?
Yeah, so there's kind of two angles of this. There's the things that directly are impacted if you have some challenges viewing things. So that could be anything from blindness, that could be color blindness, which you mentioned. It could even be something like someone wears glasses and they don't have them with them all the time. Like, it doesn't have to be a person who necessarily uses a screen reader 100% of the time. So what can we do from a visual perspective to help with that? And that's things like alt text, alternative text, which if someone is using a screen reader and the screen reader hits the image, you have the ability to add some descriptive text, tell the screen reader, here's what this photo is doing. There's some great examples for how to write alt text online. You don't essentially have to write, here's everything that's in the photo. You want to write, here's what you want to be taking away from this photo. So alt text for one project might be different than alt text for another, even if it's the same image, because you're using it in a different way.
Right.
There are really good tools online for testing your designs for different types of color blindness. There are multiple kinds out there. And there's a lot that you can do with your color palette right from the get-go to make sure that it's as friendly to the eye as possible. So maybe when you're in the design stage where you're working out what is my color palette, test it in some of those tools to make sure that what you're doing is friendly to someone with one of the multiple kinds of color blindness.
Yep.
There's also the thought of indicators shouldn't just be color. And we'll see this a lot with graphs. We'll see it with user interfaces, buttons that tell you if something is right or wrong. Think about a stoplight. You have the indicator that is the color of the light, but it's also the position on the light. So let's just say you couldn't see the color properly. The position would still give you a second indicator for what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great tip.
Yeah, and then there's the other side of this. I think we talk a lot about things like visuals from a visual accessibility perspective, but there's stuff in our visual designs that also impact other areas of accessibility. So think about if someone has trouble moving a mouse with a lot of precision because maybe they've had an arm injury, and that could be a permanent arm injury, or that could be a short-term thing. Maybe they just sprained their wrist the other day. If you have e-learning where the interaction requires a high level of precision with a mouse, that's going to be an accessibility issue for people who can't be incredibly precise. So one of the things you can do from a design perspective is make the button or the interaction area larger.
Yep.
It's a tiny thing, but it can make a huge difference. Plus, it's great for people who maybe don't need accessibility accommodations. Like maybe they're just using the mouse trackpad on their laptop, which just isn't that precise to begin with. And you'll see a lot of that with accessibility concerns when you make things better from an accessibility perspective in your design, and it has impact on everyone else as well.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, even if not all of your learners have accessibility needs, or maybe none of your learners, following those guidelines, I think actually requires you to be a more intentional designer. So for example, if you're using an image, if you had to write alt text explaining why that image was meaningful to your content, it probably would require you to rethink some of your image selections in the first place, even if you don't have any learners, utilizing that alt text. I just think it makes you have to be more intentional all around.
Yeah, and I would say this about accessibility. It is a really broad topic because we say accessibility, but it includes a whole bunch of different things that we're trying to solve for. It's not something that you can finish learning about in a 15-minute conversation on YouTube or a 30-minute session. Keep reading articles. You're going to constantly find new things to help you. And the tools that we use are constantly evolving to make things more accessible as well.
Absolutely. Well, good. Well, thanks for that question, Jesse. All right, so our final question comes from Angela Coulter. Hi, Angela. And Angela wants to know, what are your top visual design tips for increasing and retaining engagement in an e-learning course? Now, fantastic question, Angela, and thank you for submitting it. And I don't know about you, Bianca, but I have a lot of opinions on this, so I'll let you take it away first.
Yeah, I think this is a really hard question because there's not one single right answer. Visual design for things like engagement, it's as much art as it is science. Yep. And it's really just playing around with different things to find what works for you in your situation. Now, I look for inspiration on this to other fields because there's other fields that are doing this fantastically. Advertising is an amazing one. There's a lot that we have in common with presentation design. Experts like Nancy Duarte and Gar Reynolds have elevated PowerPoint presentations to this whole other level. It is not screens of bullet points. They're amazing at conveying information visually. There's a lot that what they do applies to our world. People who do data visualization, so much can be learned from how they present content in a way that's engaging that applies to our world as well. So look for inspiration, find it outside of L&D as well as inside. And something that I do is I keep a collection of things that I find inspiring. Not that I might use them right away, but something that I found a year ago that I popped into a Pinterest board, I might pull it out now for a situation that it could apply to. It's just handy to have that inspiration around.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you mentioned Nancy Duarte, her book Slideology. That's like my visual design Bible. It taught me everything I know about visual design. And I like that you mentioned looking for inspiration outside of the world of e-learning or even learning and development. When I think about what an e-learning course is, I always think of it as it's an opportunity to help your learners see what you're trying to say. And so whether you're using, motion graphics, animations, iconography, images, anything that can help elevate your message and communicate it in a visual way, I think is always a good thing, because it's not, if you're just going to put bullet points on a screen or text, give them a PDF, right? Instead, use it as opportunity to visualize what you're trying to say. And I think that helps not only just make your courses look better, but also helps elevate that content. So it's not about making it look pretty. It's about elevating that message through visual design.
Yeah, I mean, the pretty part's nice. I'm not knocking the pretty part, but the goal of what we're trying to do with the elevation that you talk about is, what are the visuals doing to help people understand things? So whether are the images helping people to understand a complex concept that's easier to explain in visuals? Are the visuals guiding the eye through the screen so people know what to interact with, what's important? There's a lot that we can learn from user experience design and user interface design on that field, but it really is not just adding that pretty polish, but does the design add to things? And if you're looking at what you're putting in your designs and bouncing it against that as your marker, what is this helping? Yep. That's also a good way to increase and retain engagement.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, hopefully that helps, Angela, and thank you so much for submitting that question. And Bianca, thanks so much for joining us. Where can people find you online if they want to reach out, connect with you, and learn from you?
Yeah, well, I'm mostly on Twitter these days at eGeeking, and you can find me nerding out about design stuff there too. I'm also on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect. And if you want some weird design inspiration, I have an Instagram account called Instructions and Directions that is all bizarre warning signs that should probably crack you all up a lot.
I love that. Well, we'll put links to those down in the description. So thanks again for joining us, Bianca.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here today.
All right, that's all we have time for in this episode. Of course, I want to thank Bianca Woods for joining to help me tackle some of those awesome questions. And as always, a big thanks to everyone who submitted a question for this month's episode. Now, if you happen to be watching this on YouTube and you want to get alerted when we publish our next episode of Ask a Trainer, make sure to click that subscribe button below. And of course, check out the ATD Ask a Trainer advice column by clicking on the link in the description. My name is Tim Slade, and until next time, I'll see you around.